Whether right or wrong, the A1c test, which determines how much glucose has been floating around in your bloodstream over the last 3 to 4 months, is considered by most American doctors as the gold standard of the diabetes tests. Yeah, you can get a fasting blood sugar test, or you can buy a home A1c test at most pharmacies. You can even get a fairly accurate A1c score by averaging around 5 or 6 glucose tests over the course of a day. But the test most trusted is the A1c you get when you go to a lab and have a technician wearing a white coat draw your blood, and then your results are usually given to you from about 1 day to 1 week later. It's been a while since I had a lab A1c test, and I decided to go and find out just what my current A1c is. One nice thing about getting an A1c test for me these days is that I don't even have to go to a doctor. I simply went online to the Ultalab Tests website and ordered a lab test. They advertised an A1c test for an amazingly cheap $12.95, but it turned out that there was a catch. There was a blood drawing fee, so I ended up paying about $20, but that's still a whole lot cheaper than if I had gone to a doctor or an endocrinologist. I gave them the location where I wanted to have the test, paid my bill with a debit card, and went to the lab on the day of my scheduled appointment. Before we get to my latest A1c score, let me share a few of my previous A1c tests. When I began this Beat Diabetes channel back in 2017, my A1c was sitting in the upper 5s. In some ways, I think now, what business did I have telling people how to beat diabetes when I was pre-diabetic myself? So, in a lot of ways, I've learned a great deal and benefited from Beat Diabetes myself. I guess you could say that I serve as both a mentor and a mentee. I learned from some of you guys, and I also have learned from the research that I've been doing to make these videos. But in those early days, I was kind of proud of my upper 5s A1c, and at least I wasn't fully diabetic, I thought, and considering all the problems my mom had with diabetes, I knew I had done myself a great favor by eating relatively low carb and keeping my A1c under 6.0. But after a couple of years doing these videos and hearing testimonies of men and women who had done a lot better than me in lowering their glucose levels, I began to desire much better numbers. In those first days, I did not practice time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. Did some fasting for religious reasons, but not like I do now. But I soon learned about these things, and before long, they had become an important part of my life and diet. I also became stricter with myself and cut out some of the iffy foods that I'd been eating. And of course, I learned about all kinds of keto meals and keto desserts that I had not considered before, which made my stricter diet a whole lot more pleasant than it would have been otherwise. And sure enough, my A1Cs improved. Here's a video clip about an A1C test I did around August 2019, a little over 3 years ago. After I kept hearing these kinds of testimonies, I was amazed, I was impressed, and I was sort of ashamed. I began to be dissatisfied with my A1C in the upper 5s and decided it was time I did something about it. So what did I do? Well, for one thing, I cut my carbs lower than before. Technically, I was a low-carb eater before, but I was probably eating perhaps 70 grams of carbs per day, and I started moving toward the 50s and lower. Another thing I did was to start skipping breakfast, not every day, but about half the time. I would have my first meal at around 12:30 p.m. and aim at a supper at 6 p.m., although I rarely ended up having it quite that early, but almost every night I'd be done with my day's eating before 7 p.m., and I wouldn't touch another bit of food until the next day. I gave up on rice. Before, I had it moderately, but now I don't eat it at all except on extremely rare occasions. I gave up on breakfast cereal and replaced it with chia seed pudding. I used to have tea time and have a sugar-free Russell Stover chocolate, candy, and a few peanuts with my tea. And I did this every single day, but these days I may do it only once or twice a week, and I normally won't be eating the Russell Stover chocolates. As a result of these changes, several things happened. My A1C dropped from the upper 5s to the lower 5s. My fasting glucose dropped from around the 110s to the 90s and sometimes the 80s. And without trying to, I ended up shedding about 10 pounds. In fact, I lost more weight than I really wanted to, and I was looking too skinny at around 159 pounds. I began eating more and eating peanuts at some of my meals just to add some weight, and I have managed to add a few pounds. I went to the lab a couple of weeks ago and recently received a copy of the results. In fact, before I had the copy, I talked to the nurse, and the one number I had to know was my A1C score. When I asked her about it, she replied pretty nonchalantly, "Oh, it's fine. It was 5.3. She had no idea just how hard I had to work for that number and how involved I've been in keeping that number low so that she could say to me, "Oh, it's fine." For her, that was no big deal. For me, it was a very big deal. So I was pretty happy with that. Actually, earlier in that year of 2019, I did a home A1C test, and here was the result. A timer will appear on the screen of the monitor, and it will start counting down from 5 minutes. Leave the monitor alone. Don't handle it until the 5 minutes have elapsed. At the end of the 5 minutes, the monitor screen will display your results. Actually, it will display 3 different messages, but 2 of them are letters. Don't worry about them. And that was pretty good as well, but I wasn't sure just how accurate those home A1C tests were, so my enthusiasm was not as great as it would have been had I seen that same result from a lab. In 2020, being the year we'd all like to forget, I didn't even attempt any kind of A1C test, but of course I did test my glucose levels at home as usual. Finally, in August 2021, I learned about the Ultalab method of ordering an A1C test online, and so I went to a local Quest Labs to have it done. It was a great experience. I did not have to wait long. Drawing the blood from my arm was no big deal, and by the next day I had an email in my inbox with a link I could click on to view my results. And I was pleased to see that I had a 5.1, the lowest A1C test I'd ever had that I knew of. In April of 2022, I made a video where I demonstrated a simple way to calculate your current A1C by taking 5 or 6 glucose tests in a day and then getting an average. But we can take 5 or 6 glucose tests over a 24-hour period, find the mathematical average, and then plug it into a converter and get a pretty fair representation of our A1C if we continue to eat the way we did that day and get the same glucose measurements. This week I did just that. I tested my glucose 6 times over a 24-hour period. I mixed it up, testing it 1 hour after a meal, 2 hours after a meal, upon awaking, shortly before bed, and a couple of other times. My numbers were these: 96, 90, 87, 101, 100, and 88. I added these numbers together, and the total was 562. I divided 562 by 6 to get my EAG, my estimated average glucose. That average was 93.66 and a never-ending number of 6s. I rounded that number to 93.7 and put it into an online converter, and it gave me an A1C of 4.9. Now, that does not mean that if you do this, you can go to the lab tomorrow and get the exact same number. If your glucose has been dropping, it will take a while, about 3 or 4 months, for your A1C to catch up with your current glucose levels. But by converting your average glucose levels to an A1C, what it means is if you continue to register numbers like those and levels like those, in about 3 months your A1C should be just what the formula gave you, in my case a 4.9. I was happy with that 4.9, but again, I would have been happier still had it been an official A1C test at a laboratory. And now we come to my latest A1C test, which was done at a laboratory using Ultalab to reserve my own A1C test at Quest Diagnostics. Again, it was a painless process with little waiting, and once again, I received my test results by email the next day. This time it was a 5.0, the lowest laboratory A1C I've ever had. One thing that stands out to me through the tests I've done through the years is that the results were remarkably consistent with each other. None of them seemed to be an anomaly or the least bit inaccurate. The second thing that stands out is that since my early 50s, I've been making significant progress toward better and better blood sugar levels. It hasn't been dramatic, not nearly as dramatic as many of the testimonies that I share with you, but for me it has been a slow and steady trek downward, closer and closer to normal glucose levels. And at the age of 69, I'm knocking on the door of normal blood sugar. And this runs directly contrary to that standard line that diabetes is chronic and progressive, and the best thing you can do is just take an ever-increasing amount of medication to try to slow your descent into the abyss of misery, sickness, and premature death. I've never taken any diabetic meds at all, none. But I have improved my metabolic health through a change of my diet with a moderate amount of exercise on an elliptical trainer and taking 1 or 2 tablets of berberine daily, and lately I do occasionally take a tablet or 2 of bitter melon. And because my glucose spikes are a thing of the past, certainly I'm not experiencing horrible insulin surges as well, which can be every bit as damaging as the high glucose. So the question is, what is the takeaway for you? Well, the takeaway is that diabetes is not as unmanageable as you've been led to believe. A long time ago, a young teenager killed a 9-foot giant with a slingshot and a smooth rock. Some of the giants in our lives look terrifying. They intimidate us, they scare us, they depress us, and make us feel like the biggest losers ever. But do not be deceived, my friend. Diabetes may be a giant, may be a monster, but it has a glass jaw and an exposed forehead. Run toward that giant with a sling and a few stones. Which stones, you ask? The stones of significant carbohydrate restriction, time-restricted eating, and a determination to stop snacking between those meals. Sling those stones at your giant, one after the other. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And you know what I think? I think that your giant, the one who's been taunting you and terrorizing you and spoiling your life, is going down. With those simple but powerful stones in your slingshot, he does not stand a chance. And when you are standing over his dead body and rejoicing to realize that your mortal foe has been slain, be sure and take a moment to thank God who has made this victory possible for you. Well, I just got through looking through my videos list to see how many total videos I have uploaded and have available on Beat Diabetes, and it is at this point 454. Now, folks, that's a lot of videos. And for the newly diagnosed diabetic, that could just be overwhelming. You'd say, I can't watch that many videos. What are the most important ones? Well, glad you asked that question. For the rest of this year, on Sunday mornings, I'm going to be posting some of the old videos stitched together back to back, 2 or 3 of them. So it's probably going to be a half hour or more from what I consider to be the most important videos that you need to see. So be watching for this special Sunday edition of Beat Diabetes now through the end of this year. The classic Beat Diabetes moments, the classic Beat Diabetes videos, ones that you really need. And I believe they're going to bless you and help you.